Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined by Keith Preston and Swithun Dobson. Unfortunately, Terminal Philosophy was not able to join us today. He had other obligations at the moment. But today's discussion will be is green energy sustainable? And so, Swithun, this was sort of your idea. So, what exactly do you have in mind with this question?
Well, firstly, there's the question that's been brought up on many occasions, which is by some people as to, well, how sort of green is green energy? How much energy usage does it require to actually even construct things like wind and solar, in particular, including hydro as well. But the primary push in recent years has been on wind and solar. But my other angle I think would be interesting to discuss is to what extent will it maintain its current popularity amongst the population? It very much seems to be the case at present that there is widespread adoption of what can only really be called the green cult. And everyone, corporations and all media types, well, at least, are promoting that, we must have this green agenda. We must do things by wind and solar. We must reduce impact on the planet. We must have net zero carbon emissions. Now, another aspect I'm interested in is to what extent this is politically sustainable. The reason I mention this is you may or may not have been aware that there is massive energy price hikes in Europe, in particular gas prices, and this basically is a result. It's not entirely, but mostly due to the reliance on wind. And this has often been cited by people going, well, actually, wind and solar aren't really perfect energy sources. Because, well, what happens if it's not windy? And it wasn't in Europe in the summer. And so consequently, you needed a backup to produce the electricity, which is gas. You can use coal in addition to gas to do this. You can't use nuclear for various technical reasons that I don't exactly understand, but I'm aware that you can't. It's very difficult to sort of increase and decrease nuclear electricity output, but you can do it relatively easy with gas and coal. But coal is essentially illegal in Europe. The last coal power station in England will be decommissioned in 2024, and I should say, it would not be particularly easy at present to try and get a new one to be built. So basically, you're relying on natural gas, as well as there being basically no wind in Europe. Last winter, it was a very cold winter in parts of Eastern Europe, and so there was a massive increase in demand for gas for not electricity generation but heating. So this all came together to create a massive spike in prices. So I think the wholesale gas price nearly tripled since about February 2021 until September, which means that domestic heating bills so if you think about mine, it's probably about 50% higher for the coming year than it would have been the previous year. That may be a slight exaggeration, it's at least 33%. It's a significant increase. And this is what, the detractors of wind and solar have said is, look, if it's not windy and it's not sunny, well, you're going to have to get the energy from somewhere else. And this is going to be higher prices. Now, you could say the higher prices are worthwhile, but the question is, to what extent will the public be happy to go, well, I'm willing to pay this price? Again, this may go down on a class division. The upper middle class will go, no, we must save the planet and we don't care about heating bills because, well, frankly, we can afford them. And the lower, middle, and working class types. So again, it could just divide across those levels. Although it would be interesting to see whether or not, in general, sort of the green energy movement loses some momentum over the next year or so, assuming the prices remain high. If they go down, then of course this may not be as much of an issue as I'm citing. But if it were to get worse, I do wonder how politically sustainable it would be when people go, well, we can't really afford it. So I think that's an interesting angle. Onto the mechanics, though, of green energy. In preparation for this, I was having a look at a document produced by the Manhattan Institute, who seem like a classic sort of quote unquote free market think tank. But I mean, you can argue about the comparisons they use, but per unit of like energy produced, like solar, or let's say wind, because I was talking about wind before. Wind is like uses like 9 times the amount of sort of steel, glass, and concrete to produce the same amount of what's the measurement they use? TWH, might be tetrawatt or something, but it would scale down. It's like 9 times as much as a natural gas plant. I mean, this is using serious amounts of materials. And again, if you move over to wind, you can't have the wind turbines too close to each other, because otherwise they make the other one slow down and therefore produce less electricity. So you need astonishing amounts of space to produce what you could produce in like a standard gas plant. So the example from here, to replace the energy output from a single 100 megawatt natural gas fired turbine, which is about the size of a residential house, it requires 20 wind turbines, each one the size of the Washington Monument, occupying some 10 square miles of land. And then, of course, you've got all the issues with respect to rare earth metal needs for wind and solar, which then gets geopolitical, because new mines in the USA, according to this article, take about 10 years to get approval. And most of the mining is done by China. So you then get an issue as, well, we can only get it if the Chinese let us have it, which may or may not be ideal going forward. So there's a geopolitical angle, there's the cost angle, and there's just like the straightforward, well, if you care about, if you think what is good for the environment is what the general green advocates are, which is, reduce impact on the external world and reduce the sort of, quote, the carbon footprint. Although the interesting is in this document they produced, they didn't actually mention that, which is interesting, because I imagine that'd be an obvious response to it. Just as if anyone's interested, the document is Mines, Minerals, and Green Energy, a reality check. So you could quibble about their comparisons, but it's still not immediately obvious to me that wind and solar, even if you are like a big green advocate, that wind and solar are the best thing. I think Michael Schellenberger came out quite clearly about this. And there was also, there was a Michael Moore-backed documentary about green energy in relatively recent times. So I think those are sort of 3 broad issues: the political angle in the domestic countries on cost, the sort of the geopolitical angle is where do you get the materials from, and then thirdly, if you're going to take this, if you just take as given the standard environmentalist playbook, are wind and solar and, to some extent hydroelectric or tidal, are they sustainable?
Yes. Now, some of the other related concepts here is, if you're like, for example, Derek Jensen, who's been a guest on the show many times, he's more of a radical environmentalist, is actually critical of the so-called green energy movement, as is, of course, Michael Moore. And one of the there's really, I guess, 2 kinds of green energy people. One is, we can have more or less the same level of energy consumption we have today with green energy. And then that's sort of one that's most popular now. And that's the one that Michael Moore was criticizing. And then there's the idea that, well, no, actually we can't. We're just all going to have to realize at some point we're going to have to drastically cut back on the energy use that we have. That's a far more radical and less popular green energy position. And those tend to be the 2 that are in conflict. Now, while technically nuclear isn't really green, we have certain free market advocates of, quote, green energy saying that we could use nuclear power because it doesn't have a lot of the pollutants that, say, coal or natural gas does. But then radical environmentalists would say, yeah, but one potential nuclear meltdown is enough to outweigh any other potential benefits. And so those 2 are in conflict a lot. We also see that with wind and solar, a lot of the resources that are used to make them, like you said, cost far more natural resources to create than their coal or oil counterparts. And in fact, a lot of their energy is produced by coal and oil because the entire production chain to get to that point is coal and oil and natural gas. So it's not really green in any meaningful sense. And if we look at like alternatives to energy sources, so we could say, well, what about nuclear? And then we store it in batteries. Well, the problem with batteries is you need lithium. And lithium is a rare earth material that you can't have a lot of. And also batteries degrade at a far greater rate than the way natural gas is stored. There really isn't anything as energy dense as hydrocarbons that are out there. And so unless you can find an alternative to that, you at the very least cannot maintain the same level of energy consumption. Now, those radical environmentalists who say that we can't, they may be right on completely independent grounds. And this is in some sense a moot point. We just have to be okay with less. But if that's not the case, and then you have the other group of green energy crowd that say, can we keep the same level of consumption? I think that kind of green energy crowd is not sustainable. It's based on certain misunderstandings or downright fabrications. Now, the other form might be sustainable, but is it a price people are willing to pay? Maybe not. And then you also have to ask the question: is that, well, they claim that eventually necessity will force it. That's an open question. Maybe it won't. If necessity does force that hand, then it's a moot point because necessity has done that for us. But I think the big issue is there aren't really any energy sources that are as energy dense, per unit as hydrocarbons. And like you said, a lot of the others, water, wind, solar, are intermittent, right? You tidal forces or dams can only produce, that's probably more reliable than, say, wind or solar. But also let's look at solar panels, right? Solar panels use a lot of rare earth materials, which themselves have to be mined and extracted using natural gas. So it really is just like an end product that looks nice. But when you look at all the steps to get to that end product, it turns out that it actually has more of a negative consequence than does what it's purporting to replace. So, Keith, what are some of your thoughts on this?
Well, there's a lot involved in these questions. The first thing is, based on my knowledge of the science of just energy production, the idea that we're somehow going to have a modern industrial civilization like our own that gets its power from windmills and solar panels is science fiction. It's just not possible to do that. And somebody that's claiming that is not serious and shouldn't be taken seriously. Also, I think a lot of the politics behind this is essentially fraudulent in the sense that you have a lot of folks who want to make money selling solar panels and promoting green energy, and they promote these kinds of ideas. And I think what they want to do is shift the focus of public policy away from, say, fossil fuels towards green energy industries. And what it amounts to is they want corporate welfare for companies that make windmills rather than companies that produce fossil fuels. So it's really a political rivalry concerning who's going to get the most corporate welfare within the energy industry. Now, of course, there are people that are more serious. And what I would say is, based on everything I know about the science of energy production, if your goal is to reduce significantly the use of fossil fuels, because that's supposed to be the goal. So the scientific argument is human consumption of fossil fuels causes climate change. Okay, so that means we're supposed to reduce the consumption of fossil fuels. The only way to do that on any significant scale is to introduce a parallel increase in the use of nuclear energy. Now, you can't do away with fossil fuels entirely, even if you're using nuclear energy. There are certain things that you just can't replace fossil fuels for, not even with nuclear energy. Now, environmentalists many of them will say, well, no, we can't have nuclear energy either. The two arguments are it's either too dangerous or it's too expensive. It's not cost effective. Those are the main two arguments I've heard against nuclear energy. There are other people, though, who are environmentalists who are for nuclear energy. Like I know Andrew Yang is one. He advocates the use of thorium Some of the, what we call tankies, Marxist-Leninist type people, old guard communists, some of them advocate that. I know Lyndon LaRouche and his crowd are big on nuclear energy. But to reduce the consumption of fossil fuels significantly, nuclear energy would have to be a significant component of that, whatever its effects otherwise in terms of energy costs or safety or whatever. It's possible to increase the use of renewables to some degree. I mean, there's a lot of different types of renewables. There's solar and wind, and also hydroelectric and geothermal and biomass and biofuel and all that. You could significantly increase the use of those and perhaps reduce the use of fossil fuels to a corresponding amount. But you can't replace fossil fuels with that stuff. At bare minimum, any use of that stuff, even on a large scale, is going to have to be supplemented by either fossil fuels or nuclear energy or a combination of both. Also, as I think you guys have pointed out, production of these renewable energy sources itself requires fossil fuels, and has energy costs associated with it. I've heard environmentalists claim that, well, Germany gets a third of its power from renewables, and that hasn't hardly made a dent in their carbon emissions either. So it's not the boom that it's considered to be. Also, some people have said, well, the reason Germany hasn't made any more progress than they have is because the initial phase of conversion to renewables requires the use of more energy, but that's not going to be an indefinite thing. And that, to me, that's kind of like the idea of the temporary government program. We're only going to have this program for 10 years and then it's going to expire, but they never expire. That just seems to me to be an unprovable assertion. So it seems to me that the best possible scenario is the only way we can have the kind of industrial civilization that we're accustomed to is you would have to significantly increase the use of nuclear energy. You could perhaps cut back on fossil fuel consumption to a corresponding amount, and then perhaps more so through the additional use of some of these renewable sources. But I think that's about as good as it's going to get. I don't think that there's any scientific basis for believing you can do more than that and maintain the same level of consumption. Now, as far as ideas like, well, we just need to consume less, or we need to do away with modern industrial civilization altogether, first of all, that's just not a sellable idea from a political perspective. If you start telling people, well, our goal, if any government anywhere in the world that told their people, our goal is for your standard of living to go down so we can preserve the environment. Well, you'll find maybe 1 in 10,000 people who might assent to that. More likely what you're going to get is something like the Yellow Vest uprising, or worse. One of the things that triggered the Yellow Vest uprising was increased carbon taxes, imposed for environmental purposes. And what Swithun says is actually absolutely correct, is that we already know how the global power elites would approach a serious environmental crisis or a serious effort to reduce energy consumption. They do it the same way they did with the pandemic lockdowns. They would try to drastically reduce energy consumption by the working classes and the poor in the developed world, and then prevent the developing world from developing any further, and encourage them to cut back on, or force them to cut back on energy consumption. Meanwhile, the global power elite, they would certainly still travel in private jets and do all the stuff they do. So it would be one standard for them and another for everything else. That's guaranteed. I will bet money that that's how that would turn out. And that would certainly provoke a lot of political conflict, as well it should. As far as the idea of doing away with industrial technology, you do that and you'll subject much of mankind to death and starvation through disease and lack of food production and things like that. I mean, that's what the world was like before we had industrial civilization. So good luck with that one. It's interesting to read some of these really far out environmentalists like the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, because they get all this. I mean, to them, the environment is so important. They say, well, we should just go back to living like the cavemen to save the environment, which I would say is more of a religious belief. It's more like a modern pantheism or something. You worship the earth so much, so that you become a martyr for earthdom or whatever. But I think a lot of the criticisms that the most extreme environmentalists have of the more middle of the road environmentalists are actually correct. I know people, for example, who belong to the Green Party in the United States who are hardcore environmentalists and really do believe in dramatic energy reduction, dramatic reduction in energy consumption, and they would probably agree with much of what we're talking about there. They would probably say, no, we can't use nuclear power. No, we can't use lithium. No, we can't use fossil fuels. I mean renewables, but so much because they have energy and environmental cost as well. And they would say reduction of consumption is the only solution, and then they'll have some kind of far out idea about how we're going to reorganize society so everybody can reduce their energy consumption. So the anarcho-primitivist and others, perhaps some others that are less and less extreme than that, they really have it right in terms of if the goal is to reduce energy consumption, that's what you're going to have to do. You're either going to have to go in that direction, or you're going to have to accept much greater use of nuclear power.
Yeah. Now, within the paradigm of an industrial society, this wouldn't be an easy sell, but another thing that you might be able to do is if you could somehow restructure society such that the entertainment and consumption industries were much smaller. So if you didn't have, all the gigawatts of energy being put into Hollywood, the tech companies building all their 4G networks and, video games and websites, and the music industry, and people just found because energy consumption is on the one hand for necessities of life, food, clothes, shelter, things like that, keeping us warm in the cold. But then also energy consumption is on what we might call elective things that we don't necessarily need to live, but enjoy having. If you could somehow reorient that away so that people's leisure time was spent some other way, you probably could significantly reduce a lot of energy and still maintain an industrial society. Now, again, that's not going to be an easy sell, but that's one thing that you could do. And I don't really see any green advocates talking about that, because it's one thing to say, well, we're going to turn off the heat in Scotland in the winter, but it's another thing to say that, we're not going to have any more Hollywood. Because you won't die if you don't have Hollywood. I mean, people be upset, of course, but they're not going to die. And obviously there are ways that you could do that. For example, before cinema, film, and video games, people went to the theater. They watched, they went to orchestras, they watched plays, they had, traveling bards. You could do all of that as a sort of like entertainment industry, if you will, at the expense of these more energy hungry things. That wouldn't reduce carbon emissions to zero, but I think it would remove a lot of elective carbon emissions. Swithun, any thoughts on that?
That's an interesting suggestion, which I haven't heard, and it actually makes a lot of sense. The infrastructure cost and maintenance of all the internet pipes and things. I looked at there was a picture recently of all the cables under like the Atlantic Ocean, which maintain the internet connections and things around. Now, of course, you could claim that the internet is essential for certain reasons. Fine, fair enough. But yeah, the entertainment aspect is, 4K streaming. It must take a huge amount of energy. 4K is massive. If you've ever seen the file sizes of 4K files in comparison to HD, they're like, unsurprisingly 4 times bigger. If not more than 4 times bigger. They're huge. They are absolutely huge in comparison. So being able to transfer that amount of data could be, you could seriously reduce the amount. That would be interesting for the environmentalists to advocate. I suspect they probably don't, because at least in my experience, the green movement tend to be very fond of the arts in many ways, and probably like film and TV. And so for that reason, don't even think about suggesting it. You're both right. The radical environmentalist position is a consistent one, which is to, we can reduce the overall energy usage. We need to, get back to nature and sort of reduce the level of industrial society. But I severely doubt that any of the power elite will allow this to happen, because if they do that, the means of their control and power disappear. Because if you see anything that they're trying to do at the moment, they're trying to upscale technology as much as they can. I wouldn't be surprised in a number of years that the central governments try to abolish cash, to make a completely cashless society, so they can monitor every single transaction that takes place. So they want to do that. One of the reasons for, I don't know if you have them in America, the government has mandated the introduction of what are called smart meters, which ostensibly are there so you can measure the energy usage at any given point in time in your house, so you can see the things that use a lot and then use less of it. But they did admit relatively recently that, yes, having a smart meter meant that in emergency situations, which of course would very unlikely happen, but it meant that they could turn your energy off. Now, this for many years was decried as a right-wing conspiracy theory, which again turned out to be true. And given the way, for instance, they want to have all these digital vaccine passports, Green Pass in Italy or whatever, there is absolutely no way at all that the power elite want to reduce energy production, because they're going to need more to increase their power. So it is an interesting sort of basic fraud, as Keith pointed out, that they want to increase energy production, or at least for them, because it means that they can control more things. And so, yeah, you could reduce it for everybody else. They are not serious in any way about reducing overall consumption. As I think I mentioned before, Michael Schellenberger is a big advocate of nuclear. My understanding with respect to the Keith's points about safety and cost, the most dangerous form of energy generation, if you look at the number of deaths, is actually hydroelectric, because dams go wrong and they move people out and things. It's like they kill people. Fukushima, I think they had with the tsunami in Japan, they had one death from there a long time away because of cancer due to radiation, and that was 16 people were ill. I mean, it was pretty, well, in the grand scheme of things, pretty negligible. And my understanding is the thorium reactor styles with the molten salt ones are, I mean, you can't have a meltdown in them, because the plug melts and then all the liquid fuel goes down. Because one of the things with the standard fission plants is they're solid fuels. Whereas if you have the molten salt ones, they don't, which from memory, which is evading me a little bit, means it just goes in and it gets too hot, you get a melt that you can't, it just disappears down. And so all the fuel is taken away from the reactor, so it can't go any higher. So it seemed very safe. As to the cost, my understanding is one of the reasons why nuclear is so darn expensive is it was basically regulated out of existence. In the USA, I don't think there's been a new nuclear power station created since about the mid to late 1970s. Ever since there was a nuclear energy body that was created, essentially no new nuclear power plant was conceived and constructed and run ever since that had been brought into existence. One of the reasons, I think, is that they need to... what was it? They never let you deviate at all from your plans, and so you have to sort of plan for absolutely everything, and you can't sort of modify anything. Everything has to be completely done. Whereas everyone knows you have any construction jobs, things are going to have to change on the ground. Things you expected to be the case aren't actually the case, and it's simply a regulatory nightmare. There was one guy who said it would take his company 10 years, and was it 10 or $100 million a year, just to grease the right palms to get mere approval to produce a nuclear power station, let alone to actually construct it. Just 10 years of lobbying and negotiation, basically bribery, although it's not officially bribery, but effectively it is, to actually get one constructed. So it does seem to be the case that the safety from certain types of nuclear things isn't really a huge issue. And to a large extent, it seems to be that the cost of nuclear is to a large degree regulatory. Now, to what extent it would be cheaper without the current regulatory system, or if you had the regulatory system you had in the 1970s. I don't know. My suspicion is relatively large, but I could be wrong. But on the use of renewable energy sources, I mean, they're perfect fine as a supplementary source of energy. I mean, if you're sort of in the middle of nowhere having a solar panel, yeah, that can make sense. Wind, fine. Supplement your electricity production. It makes a lot of sense. The problem is when it's trying to replace a major source of electricity generation for industrial society. That's where you get the problems. I do think it interesting that we've gone electric with batteries, because battery technology is basically really poor and they're incredibly expensive to produce. And storing electricity in batteries is very inefficient from a physics perspective. I'm sort of surprised that they didn't go the hydrogen route. Now, it may be because hydrogen things will explode, and there may be reasons for that. But it would seem to me that the infrastructure cost would be much, much, much less. So I do think curious that they're going on the electricity, on the battery side rather than hydrogen, because you could just replace all the petrol stations and gas stations with hydro stations, well, in principle, at least. And that did seem to be one of the big growth areas back in like the early 2000s when I was really into sort of the car industry. And it wasn't really the idea that we're going to have battery powered ones, but for seemingly over the last 10 years or so, they seem to come to the ascendancy. Now, exactly why that's the case, I don't know. But yes, some of the decisions there are somewhat curious.
All right, Keith.
Well, I think it's certainly the case that the power elite are not interested in reducing their own consumption. And I don't think they're interested in blocking technological developments that are dependent on energy consumption. If anything, it does seem to be going in the other direction, where, particularly among the rising sectors of the power elite, these tech oligarchs and folks like that, it seems that a lot of them are fascinated with transhumanism and some of them are now buying their own spaceships and that kind of stuff. And that seems to be what that sector of the elite seems to have in mind for the future. They seem to view this, seem to envision this kind of science fiction-like world of space travel and life extension and cryonics and growing artificial limbs and robots and cloning and all kinds of stuff. That seems to be what the kind of future they want, and that obviously conflicts with any kind of low tech, back to pre-industrial civilization or anything like that. I think, like I was saying before, I think that if they decided that energy consumption was a genuine problem to the point that they felt personally threatened by it, in the sense of, say, problems with climate change or whatever, I think they would just simply adopt measures to reduce energy consumption by the plebeians. In fact, they would go a lot further than the things that I mentioned earlier. They would actually try to cut back on population. I've seen some radical environmentalists advocating for the globalization of China's one-child policy. In fact, I know of there's one fellow I know personally who advocates this, and he'll say, well, it should be voluntary. We should just, there should be incentives to encourage people to only have one child, like, don't subsidize a second child or whatever, which would fly in the face of the left, welfare statist idea. Well, all children should be taken care of, and takes a village and yada yada. But I do think, though, of course, once you started introducing stuff like that, things like that tend to be a slippery slope, where eventually it would become compulsory, where you only had one child, and you would have compulsory sterilizations and all kinds of things potentially, because that's how the Chinese have done it. But I think, though, that if climate change was perceived by the power elite to be a serious threat to themselves in a way that required the drastic reduction of energy consumption, that's how they would do it. They wouldn't cut back on any of their pet projects. They'd still have rocket ships and all that. They would just try to cut back on energy consumption by the plebeians, and barring that, they would just cut back on population generally. And I would guarantee that that's how they would approach it. They would, in fact, I could very easily see them drawing up plans for a world, if they don't already have it, where elites like themselves live like gods and engage in space travel and all that kind of stuff, and everybody else does live a pre-industrial type of lifestyle. Where you have billions of people on the planet, and 85% of them live like people in pre-industrial times, but the other 15 live like Star Wars or something like that. I think that's probably the angle they would try to take.
Yeah, the I think another problem is, you mentioned, Swithun and Keith, that energy is considered important for the power elite to maintain power, and especially as they're losing credibility with the population. I could definitely see the attempted use of robots as their enforcers. I mean, China has like robot dog demos. I think some like DARPA has robot dog demos. How effective they really are at the moment is an open question. But if you're going to have a fleet of robot dogs with machine guns, and you're going to have a lot of energy for that. And you'll see, because I mean, austerity already doesn't sell well, right? I mean, a lot of these riots in Europe with like yellow vests. I mean, even 2011 with Occupy Wall Street, this was all related to austerity, but the biggest austerity of all would be a radical green agenda, right? That would be the most austere of all austerities. And it's kind of interesting, right, that the left is so wrapped up in the radical green agenda, because on the one hand, they hate the idea of austerity. Almost all the pushback against austerity beginning in 2008 comes from the left. But a thoroughgoing environmentalist policy would be more austere than the wildest dreams of Lehman Brothers. And it's like, well, you kind of can't have both of those at the same time. It doesn't work. Now, obviously, true environmentalists would say, we don't care. But what I would argue then is you should have tacitly been in favor of Lehman Brothers, because by imposing austerity on everybody, you're getting some of what you want already. Maybe not all of it, fine, but you're getting some of it. And getting closer to the goal is presumably better than not getting to the goal at all. And I also agree with Keith, the idea that the elites themselves would probably want to live in this space age society, but the rest of us would live in this, these slums, like we see in various science fiction dystopias. For example, Brave New World, right? I mean, there's a lot of people living in these savage environments, like Smith the Savage himself. He's brought to this more advanced society to see what it's like. And if we look at like the more radical environmentalist claim, about just getting rid of industrial civilization, in one sense, that would be sustainable, because that's how most of humanity lived throughout most of its existence. The question then is, how feasible is this? I mean, obviously, I don't think there's going to be an intentional human anthropocentric deconstruction of industrial technology. People aren't just going to say, yeah, we're just going to dismantle all this. What might happen, and I guess this is an open question, and a lot of science fiction has explored this. What if the means that undergird an industrial society become impossible? Right. So on the one hand, radical environmentalists would say, due to environmental degradation, due to industrial society becomes impossible. In which case, industrial society negates itself. Right. Another way industrial society might end is if we run out of crucial resources, right? There's the whole idea of peak oil. Well, what if we run out of cheap hydrocarbons? What do we do then? Or what if we run out of rare earth materials? Since we're not asteroid mining yet, where are we going to get those? And these are bottlenecks such that they don't have to run out completely, just that the cost of extracting them from the ground is so high that you can't really justify it in a market sense. How plausible are those, I guess, is my question. What are your thoughts on that, Swithun?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Would we ever get to a situation where industrial society is impossible? I suppose eventually. I mean, you get to the question as to what extent are resources actually ultimately scarce, in a sense. Now, to what extent the resource is limited? One of the arguments I've always made is that resources aren't limited in the way that you think they are. Physical stuff is, but whether something is a resource depends on your knowledge about what you can do with it. So if you keep the knowledge about what you can do with things constantly, well, then yes, you could go, well, we can only use this for so long, probably. But if you have better ways of using things, then there's more resources than you thought there were before. So, for instance, in the medieval period, oil was pretty useful, but not hugely useful. You could put it on hulls of ships to make sure that they're watertight. You could use it on torches, but that was about it. There could well be more uses that I'm omitting, but it's nowhere near as useful as when you discover fractional distillation, and you could use it in internal combustion engines. And so once that change of knowledge occurred, then there were actually more resources available. And then there's also the question of how many resources do you actually need to use going forward. So, for instance, I'm pretty sure the amount of petrol and diesel usage in the UK now is a lot lower than it used to be, even though there are more cars, because the average fuel consumption is now higher, so you need less of it. So, because I used to remember most cars did like 20 or 30 miles to the gallon. Now, a lot of them regularly do 40 to 50, which makes a significant difference in the amount of fuel that you need. So, whether we would get to a situation where, whether we ever get to a situation where industrial society just becomes too expensive to maintain, I think is unlikely, though possible. Basically, because in most of the historical cases where you've had sort of shortages of certain resources, eventually something has come up with a decent workaround. So one of the stories was, I can't remember exactly the time period, but in the US, whale oil was the major source of oil lamps. And then the whales sort of got more scarce and therefore became astonishingly expensive. At which point people thought, this kind of oil stuff's kind of useful. Can we not use something else? And figured out, well, you could use sort of crude oil for doing it as opposed to whales. So assuming we can continue that level of innovation in certain ways, then I don't see why we couldn't. Although that is interesting with the population angle, though, is to whether, and this goes to the old sort of genetic determinists as to whether or not society is getting more stupid over time. Edward Dutton, sort of a evolutionary psychologist, argues that the per capita innovation rates now have gone down to the Elizabethan levels, much down from its height, I think, in the mid 19th or early 19th century. And Keith mentions birth rates. You do have a situation where you have those who score with higher IQ have fewer children now, where historically they would have had more surviving children because on average they would have been richer and therefore their children would have survived, whereas the poorer wouldn't. And so whether or not idiocracy will ever come to fruition is an interesting question. Because if it did, then industrial society has got a bit of a problem. Just on the last thing on birth rates, Ted Kaczynski actually argued that the radical environmentalists should actually have more children because he recognized that a lot of traits were genetically determined. And so he said, well, actually, this is going to be a bit of a problem if everyone did it, but population has to come down anyway. So if we want to win, biological warfare is something we should use. So that was quite interesting that he actually advocated that you should, if you were a radical environmentalist, that you should have more children on that basis.
All right, Keith.
In some ways, I think a lot of the contemporary debate about the impact of climate change and other environmental factors over time is a revisitation of the argument advanced by Malthus, which was, of course, the idea that eventually the human population would become unsustainable because the human population would grow faster than the ability to produce food. Now, of course, as we know, what Malthus didn't anticipate was the Industrial Revolution and the kind of massive the ability to produce food on a mass scale that we have in modern societies that you didn't have in his time in the early modern era. And it may be that environmental issues are resolved in a similar form. It could be that technological innovation in the future will be such that these kinds of things become obsolete for those reasons, for technological reasons. So I do think that's an interesting aspect as well to look at. Also, we see that in some parts of the world, the birth rates are falling. We actually see birth rates are falling in the wealthy, developed countries and rising in the poor countries, the underdeveloped countries. And I think that could very easily contribute to greater conflict in the future between the global north and the global south, because if the global elites are located in the global north primarily, and if they see population growth as a problem, which I think they increasingly will if they continue to hold to the view that the environment is in serious danger, I could very easily see them trying to impose a Chinese-like one-child policy on the developing world, even if they don't do it in the developed world per se. And I think that will, of course, lead to even greater problems. We can guess how that might turn out. I think that in many ways that's the main concern I have about the way the whole green energy debate is going. It looks like that increasingly you have people in the environmentalist circles for whom environmentalism is this kind of pantheist religion in a way. And of course, when the power elite when the distribution of power and the power elite come into the equation, we see that this is only going to apply to ordinary people. And I do think that the pandemic situation has created a kind of prototype for what we might experience in the future, where there would be climate lockdowns and energy control lockdowns and that kind of thing, which of course won't apply to the actual policymakers. I mean, they are the ones who are flouting the public health lockdown provisions, so then they would do the same thing when it came to environmental or climate or energy consumption or whatever. I think that another issue is that this is going to be some of this stuff is probably going to be a major dividing line politically in the future. Because first of all, it's not compatible with the standard leftist position of trying to improve the material conditions of the working class and the poor, and certainly the third world poor and all of that. So I think you're going to see real conflicts between environmentalists on one hand and more traditional socialists and labor types and economic leftists on the other hand. In fact, we're already seeing that. Like, I know some of the most zealously outspoken anti-lockdown people that I've encountered during the pandemic have been so-called tankies. That is, Marxist-Leninists, who whatever else could be said about them, they actually take the whole, materialist paradigm of improving the material conditions of the working class seriously, and a lot of them are advocating going to nuclear power and things like that. So, it's the hardcore environmentalism was always something that, well, I don't know about hardcore environmentalism when you talk about the ones that want to do away with industrial civilization altogether, but environmentalism was always sort of an elitist project anyway. If you go back and look at how conservation movements began, they often were started by people that would be considered far right today. For instance, in the United States, Madison Grant and figures like that were really big on conservation, and they often mixed that with things like eugenics and racism and a lot of things of that nature as well. And these kind of global power elites that we had in the 20th century, like for example, the Rockefeller types, they were always really big on promoting contraception and abortion and stuff like that. And I think that paradigm is probably going to reemerge in elite circles once again, where you see a sort of elitist type of environmentalism fused with the idea, well, we've got to control breeding by the unwashed masses and things like that. To me, that's the natural, logical outcome of the environmentalist ideology.
Yeah, when it given that we're nearing the end of the hour, we'll start with the closing statements. But what I think we've sort of touched on is that there are at least two kinds of environmentalists. One kind that says you can maintain green energy, you can maintain current levels of energy consumption with green energy. And I think we also pretty much all agree that that's just a fraud. And then there's the other kind, which says, well, we need to drastically cut back energy consumption. And while in theory that might be sustainable, the question is that even a viable political platform that anybody could work on? Second of all, we seem to have agreed on the fact that the sort of radical austerity that environmentalism entails doesn't really fit nicely and neatly within the rest of the suite of left-wing values. And I do see the future of radical environmentalism being the far right. So, for example, we have had, for example, countercurrents, right? Greg Johnson and other far alt-right figures have been very pro-radical environmentalist. I forget his name, but there is that Finnish radical environmentalist, like the early 2000s. They were
Petni Leikola.
They were floating him around a lot as an example. And then there was even recently, this is, I think, before COVID, like 2019, a media blitz talking about, eco-fascism, basically, because there was, I think, radical environmentalists tend to be anti-immigration. So, for example, the founders of Earth First are opposed to immigration because they understand that the immigrants are going to consume way more energy in the United States than they will if they stay where they came from. And that whole group is being labeled as eco-fascist. And I'm beginning to wonder if, you look at the way the alt-right with its sort of Nietzschean, Homeric outlook, idealizes this primitivist lifestyle in a way that's more self-consciously consistent than, say, the crunchy lefty anarcho-primitivists. I mean, if you live in an anarcho-primitive society, it's basically Conan the Barbarian and Homer. I mean, that's what you're going to be dealing with. And so I think we can tentatively say that the environmentalist movement is going to be essentially a radical right-wing movement into the future. And that industrial society may or may not destroy the foundations for its own existence. I think that's sort of what we've sort of come to agree on. Swithun, Dobson, your final thought.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, a lot of sort of conservative types disliked the Industrial Revolution because of it changed the traditional sort of agrarian society and made people a lot more mobile. And so trying to prevent people being more mobile could be a good thing. So that would be that makes sense. And also, wasn't the mosque shooter in New Zealand an avowed environmentalist and sort of self-described sort of right-winger of some description? So I could see that happening as we go forward. Interesting with the one-child policy Keith mentioned is that China have recently got rid of the one-child policy, replaced it with the two, and the People's Bank of China, which is the China central bank, authored a report recently saying they should abolish all restrictions on fertility and should encourage women to have 3 or more children, because the Chinese population is going to go down in the next 30 years. And also, it's economically a problem when you're committed to maintaining your elderly population in reasonable comfort before their deaths, when you don't have that many working Chinese. So to what extent there's a balancing act that they need to do. Maybe they need to sort of get rid of the welfare state in a meaningful sense before they start putting fertility restrictions on, because otherwise you might not have enough resources to maintain the elderly in your population. So that is an interesting change with respect to China.
All right, Keith, final thoughts.
Yeah, I think you're right in the sense that the implications of the environmentalist ideology are far right. Like I've said before, historically, the left was about improving the material condition of the working class, which is not compatible with the environmentalist ideology of reducing consumption in order to save the planet. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, historically, ecological interests were often just as likely to be associated with the far right as the far left. But incidentally, that was true of things like homosexuality and transgenderism and some of those kinds of things as well. So a lot of the kind of pink and green radicalism that comes out of the post 60s left does overlap in many ways with the elements of the right wing of past times. And in fact, some of your hardcore Marxists today, like Caleb Malpin, are starting to point that out once again, that, actually, some of this stuff is actually kind of right wingy when you look at its roots. Yeah, in fact, I could see a paradigm shift taking place where you have the left actually becoming in favor of, the materialist oriented left, the ones that are about improving material consumption. I can see those sectors of the left increasingly moving for the promotion of nuclear power and things like that, and then the right becoming more environmentally oriented about, well, no, we've got to cut back on energy consumption. It's for whatever reason, and along with it, embracing things like immigration restrictions and all of those kinds of things as well. That would probably be in many ways more consistent with what the right and left were historically. Because a lot of this debate is defined within an American context, and because America has so much international influence, environmentalism is thought of as being the left, and then consumerism, over alles, is thought of as being on the right. But that isn't necessarily where it was in past times at all. And I can see that shift taking place once again, with particularly if environmental conditions continue to worsen.
Yes. Well, thanks again, Swithun, Keith. It's always a pleasure. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.